Hello and welcome back. This is the second part in our beginning theory series. We have talked about structuralism so far, and our topic in this part is deconstruction. Deconstruction. Deconstruction, structuralism, these are for our purposes ways of reading texts, ways of engaging with the text. In that regard, it's worth asking. This is one question I'd like to raise and invite you to think about as we go through these topics. Is where does a style of reading come from? Are there personality types like the structuralist personality type and deconstructive personality type? Is it a matter of the type of person you are, your temperaments? Or are there periods in history during which one or some of these styles become timely, become appropriate? Like periods in history during which deconstruction or movements like deconstruction become the dominant response, dominant style of reading, response to text. Are there texts that more clearly invite a deconstructive reading? Is it a matter of the type of text that we confront? In this series, regardless, in this series, I am concerned with the cultivation of freedom, freedom of thought, freedom in our reading life, and theory as a practice of freedom. So I want to present deconstructive reading as one possibility for us, one option. Let's begin with a quote from the text. Actually, it is not by Peter Barry himself. The quote is by Barbara Johnson, and from her book, The Critical Difference. We read, quote, "Deconstruction is not synonymous with destruction. It is in fact much closer to the original meaning of the word analysis, which etymologically means to undo. The deconstruction of a text does not proceed by random doubt or arbitrary subversion, but by the careful teasing out of warring forces of significance within a text." End quote. So deconstruction is about teasing out different forces or tendencies within the text, identifying the differences, identifying that these forces, these tendencies, movements are in fact different, distinct within the same text. Deconstruction is a response to structuralism because structuralism wants to find unity and consistency and harmony within a text. But in fact, structuralism is one of the conditions of possibility for deconstruction. That is why the terms deconstruction and post-structuralism are used interchangeably in many discussions. So by understanding deconstruction, we are at the same time gaining more clarity about structuralism too. So let's talk about the contrast between the two styles, structuralism and deconstruction. Structuralism, as I said, wants to find unity. It wants to find out the larger, stable structures that are operating within the text or underneath the text, or we can say larger structures that have shaped, produced the given text. Those structures aren't just interconnected pieces that are organized. They are also structures that are organizing value, power, or at least priority. Any structure is a reflection of a set of priorities, or any structure is a reflection of a way of prioritizing things. Post-structuralism or deconstruction is critical of unified structures, if unified of the attitude that says, okay, we found the structures and that's it. On principle or in principle, it is skeptical and critical of that kind of identification. And when post-structuralists critique a system of a system or a way of organization, they are critiquing a system of priority, a system of evaluation and valuation, and how that system is an interplay between what we pay attention to and what we suppress or what we repress. So according to post-structuralism, there are hidden structures, hidden tendencies, hidden ways of organizing that this dominant visible structure is hiding, repressing. If you like to see an example of a structuralist analysis, you can listen to my reviews of Hear the Wind Sing or Pinball, both by Haruki Murakami. In those reviews, I make assertions about Murakami's underlying conceptual structures, at least in those books, and I say that, for example, loss is a big concept in those books, and in addition, dichotomies between youth and aging, past and present. And then what do? Once I make those assertions, I go in and find evidence for my claims. I pick different parts of the novel and show their connections to the conceptual structures that I believe the novel is trying to express, trying to flesh out. I pick different scenarios from the book, different events, and argue that they are all expressions of one underlying set of concepts or one underlying feeling or attitude that Murakami is trying to express. Now, if you happen to watch those reviews, I'd like you to think about what would a deconstructive analysis do? And that question makes sense because a structuralist review, a structuralist analysis of a text is the first step that prepares a deconstructive reading. And I will return to those reviews of Murakami when we get to the discussion of modernism and postmodernism because they are relevant to that topic as well. You can read nonfiction books or articles in a similar style, structuralism or post-structuralism, applying those styles to them. When I read Jordan Peterson's third book, Beyond Order, I argued that his arguments are not really consistent with the dichotomy that he's claiming to be structuring his thought. He claims that it is the dichotomy between order and chaos that he's concerned with, between culture and nature, confusion and narrative. But the true structure operating in his work is a divide between competing cultural orders. He just refers to the one order, one cultural order that he doesn't like as chaos. Similarly, you can think about, for example, Rutger Bregman's book Humankind in terms of oppositions between dark views of human nature and bright views, optimistic views. That was my starting point in critiquing Bregman's book. Because a structuralist reading generates a neat organization of a text, it actually prepares the next stage. It prepares the post-structuralist or deconstructive reading. Why? Because once you have a neat map imposed on the text, the parts that don't fit that general map, that neat map, stand out. The map actually helps us identify the inconsistencies, whatever that doesn't fit the map. So you've heard the expression, the map isn't the territory. The map allows us, our use of the map allows us to identify the parts of the territory that don't fit the map because they stand out. Let's read another helpful passage from the book. Quote, in talking about structuralism, we discussed how structuralists look for such features in the text as parallels, echoes, reflections. So repetition of the same structural principles, repetition and confirmation, consistency. The effect of doing this is often to show a unity of purpose within the text, as if the text knows what it wants to do and has directed all its means toward this end. By contrast, the deconstructionist aims to show that the text is at war with itself. It is a house divided and disunified. End quote. So as Barbara Johnson said, we want to identify the warring sides within the text and show that the text is actually disunified. Okay, now we get to the point where I want to talk about the main example and application of deconstruction, main example. And that is James Baldwin's novel, Giovanni's Room. I have a video on this book already. You don't need to have watched that. You don't need to have read the book for our purpose. What matters here in this example is to note that there is a relatively obvious reading of the text, and then there is a less obvious reading, the deconstructive reading of the text. So let's review the obvious reading, the obvious interpretation. What is the relatively obvious reading? The story is told from the point of view of David. David loves Giovanni, but cannot be with him. According to the obvious reading, David's reason against being with Giovanni, what ultimately ends their relationship, is that David is unable to accept his homosexuality. He is unable to express who he is openly, or unwilling, or afraid. Consistent with this rather obvious reading of the text, we read about an earlier memory of David wanting to be with Joey, but again, not staying with Joey for the same reasons. Not being able to open up, go public about being gay. The story of Giovanni's room, therefore, is the story of David's disappointment with himself. David is blaming himself. It's the story of his failure to be courageous, to be himself, to be who he is publicly, and in doing so, through that, to be with the person he loves. Okay, it's the story of him not doing those things, not being able to do those things. At this point, the deconstructive style enters. But the way it enters, we should be mindful of how the deconstructive style comes in. It doesn't come in to say, you're wrong, you got it wrong, you're so naive. Let me tell you how to interpret the story. That will be an alternative structuralist interpretation, or an alternative reading of the text. The deconstructive style comes in and says, yes, that's all right, that all makes sense. But there is more. There is more in the text. In other words, the text is not at peace with itself. It is at war. There's a war going on. There's another reading, or there's other tendencies in the text. And that is corresponding to the less obvious reading of the novel. What is the less obvious reading? In the less obvious reading, Giovanni's room isn't the story of David blaming himself, David's disappointment with himself. It is the story of David's disappointment with Giovanni. Why? Because to be together, in order for them to be together, it is not just necessary for David to accept himself, to stand up for their relationship, to go against the norms of society at the time. It is also necessary for Giovanni, his potential partner, to be able to have some level of strength, some level of resilience, to be able to stand up for himself, to show character, to show reliability. But Giovanni can't do that. And it becomes obvious throughout the novel that Giovanni is not able to do that. He's not able to be, David cannot rely on him as a dependable, strong partner. Giovanni is financially dependent on other people. His room where he's staying is not, he doesn't pay rent, or he hasn't rented the room himself. It's a maid's room. There's a lack of, in general, solidity in his character. So can Giovanni be a partner? Not only a romantic, sexual partner, but in the sense of going against the cultural current with David. Can David see Giovanni as a partner in standing up against the norms? There's a filthy character, immoral character, an older man who Giovanni depends on financially, and he gets closer with him once David and Giovanni break up. That's another revelation, concerning revelation, or worrying. His willingness to depend on this immoral character is another indication that he isn't ready, probably, for a serious partnership. David himself doesn't come up with this reading that I'm talking about. David might not even be fully conscious of this reading, but that's part of the point of deconstruction. Part of the point is to identify what is unconscious in the text. Let me take this a little bit further. What happens to Giovanni? Something happens to Giovanni and he dies, or he gets sentenced to death. James Baldwin, the writer, the author, is doing this with Giovanni. Why is he doing this? Why is it necessary for Baldwin to kill Giovanni? He's choosing to do so. He chooses to do so because he wants to redeem Giovanni. He wants to redeem him, to keep him out of the focus of blame, and keep David as the focus of blame. He wants the focus of disappointment, blame, all the negativity to be on David. So he kills Giovanni, so he's liberated from that kind of judgment. This reading of Giovanni's Room isn't something I've picked up from somewhere else. I'm not saying it's the best way to think about the novel, or even the best deconstructive reading of the text. I just wrote it as I was preparing this video to illustrate the style of inspecting the text, with the assumption that it is not unified, that competing tendencies, inconsistent tendencies are in it. The text isn't at peace. If a novel is the product of a human mind, and if the human mind contains conflicts and paradoxes, perhaps some of those inconsistencies and paradoxes are carried over into the text, into the novel. Another helpful passage from the book. Let me read this and then I'll end this part. Quote, the task of deconstructing the text is often referred to as reading against the grain, or reading the text against itself, with the purpose of knowing the text as it cannot know itself. These are phrases borrowed from Terry Eagleton. A way of describing this would be to say that deconstructive reading uncovers the unconscious rather than the conscious dimension of the text, all the things which its overt textuality glosses over or fails to recognize, end quote. Okay? So, speaking of the unconscious, what are we going to talk about next time? Psychoanalysis. Essentially, Freud and Lacan. There are alternative psychoanalytic theories, like Jungian literary theory, but in this series, we are going to stay with the major players. And there are two major players in psychoanalytic theory: Freud, Sigmund Freud, and Jacques Lacan. That's it. Thank you for your support. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for listening. And till next time.